Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan, and today I'm presenting my dissertation research, When Intersectionality Becomes a Barrier. Couples therapy access among LGBTQ+ individuals from ethnic minority backgrounds. This topic has a personal note. I identify as a gay man and have been in intercultural relationships. Through both experience and the literature, I suspected there was a gap in the research. So, let's get started. I'll take you through the study in 6 sections: background and rationale, the research question, how the study was conducted, the findings, discussion, and finally, implications and future research. The findings are where I think things get really interesting. So do stay with me. Before I get into the study itself, I want to ground you in why this research matters. Around 40 to 45% of UK marriages end in divorce. Relational distress is genuinely widespread, and it's not just a personal issue. Research consistently links poor relationship quality to anxiety, depression, and reduced well-being. This holds true not just in the general populations, but specifically in sexual and gender minority relationships and in intercultural couples too. So couples therapy is increasingly important, but significant barriers stop people accessing it. Cost, scheduling, and location are the most well documented. So what does the existing literature tell us? Starting with what we know about barriers generally. Hubbard and Anderson in 2022 and Williamson and colleagues in 2019 both document real significant barriers to couples therapy, but both relied on white heterosexual samples. So we know barriers exist, we just don't know what they look like for everyone else. When we look at LGBTQ+ specific research, Meyer's minority stress model tells us that stigma, prejudice, and discrimination create chronic stress that shapes whether people feel safe enough to seek help at all. And Cruciani and colleagues in 2024 found that many therapists lack specific LGBTQ+ training. Finding positive attitudes alone aren't enough. And for the ethnic minority population specifically, Alam and colleagues in 2024 show that racially minoritized people in the UK face distinct barriers to mental health support. Spengler's review in 2020 found that even couples therapy research itself has historically excluded sexual and gender minorities. So we have the pieces of the picture, but they've never been examined together. When it comes to couples counselling specifically, the research landscape is remarkably sparse. There is very little examining barriers for LGBTQ+ individuals and very little examining barriers for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and nothing looking at both together. What we do have comes largely from the broader mental health access literature. Parmenter and colleagues in 2021 and Solano and colleagues in 2023 both highlight the importance of examining intersecting identities when looking at help seeking. But this work is not specific to couples counselling. And this is where Crenshaw's intersectionality framework becomes central. Identities don't simply stack. Their intersection creates a qualitatively distinct experience that existing research focused on individual therapy and broader mental health access simply hasn't addressed in the context of couples counselling. That is the gap this study addresses. So this brings me to the research question. What barriers do people from LGBTQ+ and culturally diverse communities face when accessing couples counselling? let's get into how we went about finding it. So this was a qualitative inductive study. 9 participants who all identified as LGBTQ+ and from a non-white ethnic background. They didn't all have to have attended couples therapy, and they could be either in or not in a relationship. We wanted to understand the barriers across different experiences. Semi-structured interviews via Microsoft Teams that were around 20 to 30 minutes each, and the analysis followed a Braun and Clark thematic analysis. Ethical approval was granted by Bangor University. So, what did we find out? The analysis produced 3 themes. Theme 1, structural inequalities determine who can and cannot access couples therapy. Theme 2, therapy as a space perceived to exclude diverse identities. And theme 3, intersecting identities create extra challenges that existing systems don't fully capture. I'll take you through each in turn. So, theme 1, structural inequalities determining who can and cannot access couples therapy. Subtheme 1, cost limits access. One participant described paying around £150 per hour, entirely out of pocket, calling it a substantial commitment. Several also raised the uncertainty of vesting that kind of money with no guarantee of results. Subtheme 2, structural and geographic barriers limit availability. P2 described potentially having just one psychologist within 100 miles. And if the person isn't the right fit, what then? Subtheme 3, mutual readiness as a prerequisite. Participant A put it simply, one person is going to suggest therapy. It doesn't assure that the second person is going to accept it. What these 3 subthemes share, barriers emerge before any search for a therapist even begins. Okay, so our next theme, theme 2, therapy as a space perceived to exclude diverse identities. Subtheme 1 for this is stigma blocks help seeking. P4 described it really clearly. It's not just the social stigma, it's also the personal ego that you need to overcome. Community pressure and personal shame operating together. Subtheme 2, exclusion of non-white and LGBTQ couples. P1 said, I think of couples counselling as very heterosexual, just for straight people. Participants described rarely, if ever, seeing themselves reflected in the advertising or therapist profiles. And subtheme 3, concerns about therapist biased. P9 described not wanting to turn up at someone's door and have them not know what to do with us. Some participants had also directly experienced feeling that a therapist had taken sides or wasn't neutral. Therapy as an institution was perceived as not built for them, even before a session begins. So finally, we have theme 3. Intersecting identities create extra challenges that existing systems don't fully capture. I think this is where the findings become most distinct. So the first sub-theme looks at how cultural context shapes sexual identity. So participant 2 described it as a hierarchy. Culture comes first, and if that cultural environment around you doesn't support your sexuality, you simply can't express it openly or live it freely. The second sub-theme looks at that intercultural relationship dynamic. So participants described fundamental differences between partners. Things around family roles, commitment, and the meaning of partnership itself. One of the participants put it quite plainly, what works for British couples might not work in other cultural contexts. What both subthemes show is that you cannot understand these barriers by looking at cultural identity or sexual identity in isolation. Together, they sort of create something distinct. So, what do these findings mean? For theme 1, cost and access. Financial barriers to couples therapy are well established in the literature. But what this study adds is that for this group, cost doesn't operate in isolation. It's about part of the wider set of conditions that together shape whether therapy feels realistically accessible at all. On geography, the barrier here isn't simply distance. Even where services exist locally, if a therapist doesn't feel culturally competent or representative enough, the service still feels inaccessible. Proximity alone isn't enough, and that's a layer that existing literature hadn't captured. And on mutual readiness, this is a relational barrier that largely unique to couples therapy and absent from individual therapy research. Even when all other conditions are met, one partner's reluctance can prevent access entirely. It adds a dimension that existing frameworks simply don't account for. Okay, and for theme 2, on stigma. The barrier here operates at 2 levels. Community norms around self-sufficiency and keeping personal matters private create external pressure. But what this study shows is that those norms had also been internalized. Participants weren't just navigating what their communities thought, they were regulating their own help seeking. On representation, the barrier is the absence of diverse identities in how therapy presents itself. Participants read the absence as a signal. This service isn't for people like me. Spengler's review in 2020 showed that couples therapy research has historically marginalized sexual minorities. This study shows that ethnic identity adds another layer of that exclusion. And on therapy biased, the barrier exists in 2 forms. Anticipated bias stops people from seeking therapy in the first place. Experience bias undermines the therapeutic alliance once they're there. And it goes deeper than training alone. It's about self-awareness and knowing the limits of your own competence. So as a therapist, recognizing when a client's intersecting identities fall outside your experience is itself a core clinical skill. So this brings us to our final theme to discuss. Intersecting identities create extra challenges that existing systems don't fully capture. We'll start with the sub-theme of cultural context shapes sexual identity. This is where participants described how cultural context shapes both the experience and expression of their sexual identity. An openness about sexuality depended on feelings of cultural safety and acceptance. If that safety wasn't there, expression simply wasn't possible. So they also reported that cultural identity was sometimes prioritized over sexual identity, and that concealment could function as a form of protection within a family and community context. So this wasn't about hiding for no reason, it was a rational response to the environment. And so the key findings here is that minority stress wasn't only experienced through the wider societal stigma, it was also operating through cultural and familiar expectations, a much more intimate and harder to navigate form of pressure. Do you make sense of that? So sexual identity expression was shaped through the intersection of cultural, family, and sexuality, not one of those things alone. So this hierarchy of identity has been seen in broader mental health research by Serrano, Hankis, Brandstrom, and Meyer. So this leads us to our second intersectional finding, intercultural relationships. What happens when 2 partners come from different cultural backgrounds? Participants describe relational strain arising from differing cultural expectations around family roles, relationship norms, and the meaning of partnership itself. These weren't minor differences, they were fundamental to how each partner understood the relationship and their responsibilities within it. Importantly, participants recognized these dynamics might benefit from support, but the couples therapy wasn't always seen as clearly positioned to address them. The concern was whether a therapist operating within a predominantly Western framework would fully understand the cultural context shaping each partner. Gavin Singh highlighted how therapy often fails to reflect the experiences of racially diverse couples. An alarming colleague suggested Western therapeutic models may not always align with non-Western cultural values. Cayley and Eldridge emphasize exploring cultural differences early in intercultural therapy, but participants were uncertain whether that level of sensitivity would consistently be present in practice. The overall findings: the barrier is not a lack of perceived value in couples therapy, it is uncertainty about whether therapy, as currently delivered, would be sufficiently culturally responsive to meet intercultural needs. Okay, so what do these findings mean for practice? The implications sit at three levels. At an institutional level, how couples therapy is promoted and represented matters. When people don't see themselves in advertising or therapist profiles, the message received is that the service isn't for them. Institutions need to actively signal inclusivity. Flexible delivery options and accessible pricing also need to be part of that conversation. At the level of individual therapists, cultural competence training alone isn't sufficient. What participants describe points to the need for genuine self-awareness. Knowing what you don't know, recognizing when a client's intersecting identities falls outside your experience, rather than proceeding as if your existing framework is adequate. Reflective practice and supervision are where that kind of awareness gets developed. And at the level of service design, therapeutic frameworks need to move beyond Western assumptions about what relationships look like, what family means, and what the goals of couples therapy are. Affirmative and intercultural approaches need to be embedded, not bolted on. Taken together, these implications point to a system that needs to catch up with the diversity of the population it serves. Before I conclude, I just want to briefly address the limitations of this study. I'd like to frame these as directions forward rather than shortcomings. The sample included several participants from South Asian backgrounds, which gave us rich insights into the intersection of cultural identity and sexuality. But broader ethnic representation in future research would help us understand whether these barriers operate differently across different communities. The self-selected nature of recruitment gave us depth and richness, but targeting recruitment strategies could help access a wider range of perspectives. This was intentionally an exploratory qualitative study. The logical next step is a quantitative research that could test the prevalence and relative importance of what we've identified here. And finally, this study focused entirely on participants' lived experience. What we don't know yet is how therapists themselves experience working with this group. That's a generally important next step. So to bring everything together, this study found that barriers to couples therapy for LGBTQ plus individuals from ethnic minority backgrounds operates across three levels: structural, representational, and intersectional. And crucially, they can compound each other. They cannot be understood by examining cultural or sexual identity in isolation. That is a central argument of this study, and therapy as currently delivered may not have kept pace with the diversity of the population it serves. When culture and sexuality intersect, a new lens is needed, one that sees both and what emerges between them. I hope that gives you something to carry into your own practice. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions about the research, I'm more than happy to be contacted, and you'll see the email on the screen. Thank you. And here are all my references. Bye, everybody.